Um, Thank you all for joining us today for this event to celebrate Europe Day. My name is Catherine Flynn. I'm Professor of English and Director of Irish Studies at UC Berkeley, a new program which aims to deepen relations between UC Berkeley and Ireland through events and programs around research, culture, diplomacy, and innovation. Today, I'm honored to welcome Frances Fitzgerald, a member of the European Parliament since 2019. Frances Fitzgerald has served as Taoiseach, or Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, from 2016 to 2017, one of only 4 women to have held this position. She has also served as Minister for Business, Enterprise and Innovation, Minister for Justice and Equality, and was the state's first Minister for Children and Youth Affairs. Prior to her election to the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, she served as Chair of the National Women's Council of Ireland and Vice President of the European Women's Lobby. Leading the conversation today will be Akasemi Newsome, Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies at UC Berkeley. Akasemi is a political scientist who specializes on the politics of labor, immigration, and comparative racialization in Europe in the context of rights, global governance, capitalist development, and social movements. We're also delighted to welcome today Consul General of Ireland to the Western United States, Robert O'Driscoll. Robert took up the position in 2017, having previously served in Brussels, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Dublin. Robert has an MA in International Security and Conflict Studies from DCU, a BA in History and Political Science from Trinity, and a diploma in Economic Analysis from the NUI. Robert will say a few words of welcome to kick us off today.
Well, thanks, Catherine, and thanks so much for having me here today and for organising this event. I want to begin by thanking you and for your leadership of the Irish Studies programme at UC Berkeley. Also want to thank, obviously, Frances Fitzgerald, MEP, for joining us here all the way from my home in Dublin in Ireland. I know there's a lot of pressure on your time, so I really appreciate you making the time so late in the evening there to join us for a lunchtime discussion here in the Bay Area. I also want to thank Akasemi Newsome, and of course the Institute of European Studies in Berkeley, which celebrated a very important anniversary last year, and which is just an enormous connection point between Europe, the EU, and the Bay Area. So thank you so much for moderating the discussion today. Yesterday was May 9th, it's Europe Day, the 72nd anniversary of the Schuman Declaration, I think seen by many people as a departure point in Europe on our shared journey towards a union of the peoples of Europe. And with all anniversaries, it's a good opportunity to take stock, to look at the past, present, and future of the European Union. And the conversation today is going to touch on all of those. Maybe 3 quick points I want to make before we get into the discussion proper. Is one, I mean, for me as an Irish person, the European Union is, in its foundation, the greatest peace project anywhere in the world, forged out of the embers of the Second World War. But obviously it's also had a huge impact on the island of Ireland. European Union membership was the context of shared European Union membership was a huge important part of the Good Friday Agreement. And over the last number of years as the Brexit conversation has unfolded, the European Union has played an instrumental role in making sure there's no return to the borders of the past on the island of Ireland. I think that's a really important role, and EU solidarity has been hugely important to that. I make the point in every audience that I speak to that is the case. Second, I think we're all living through this pandemic, and the European Consul Generals all across the Northern California, what we've been doing this week, and we are doing for the rest this week, is pointing out how European Union companies and researchers and people, frontline service people, have been such an important part of the pandemic response here, not only responding to the public health emergency, but also supporting California as California builds back better along with the rest of the US. And I'm very excited, looking forward to further transatlantic collaboration over the next while, what Europe and the US and Ireland and California can achieve in that end. I think maybe the third thing I'd say is the weekend just gone witnessed the very start of the conference on the future of Europe. It was a really important conversation about what the European Union will look like going forward, a really exciting conversation where all of the people of Europe will be engaged in an enormous kind of dialogue. And I hope that our diaspora here across Western America and California and the Bay Area also participate in that, because while we leave home, we all know that we're not living in the European Union. The European Union and its values have a global significance. I think it's important for people to feed into that conversation and to give their perspectives of what the future of our union looks like. So I want to thank you again, Catherine, for having us here today, and pass it back to you to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Robert. And now I'll hand it over to Akasemi.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for your energy in bringing this event together. Thank you, Robert, as well, for your support. It's just wonderful to have such a strong Irish presence in the San Francisco Bay Area. Thanks as well to my colleagues at the Institute of European Study, especially Julia Nelson, for their hard work. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Francis. It really is a privilege to have you join us for this conversation. And without further ado, let's get started. So as many in our audience are familiar with, just this past Sunday was Europe Day. And as Robert so eloquently also mentioned, Europe Day is really seen to be a celebration of peace, of unity in Europe. And it really marks the 71st anniversary of the historic Schuman Declaration, in which French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed the creation of that initial coal and steel community, in which European nations, a smaller group initially, of course, would pool their economic resources. And the idea being that through these economic links, war, the thought of war, the possibility of war would become impossible. We have seen several decades of peace since that initial Schuman Declaration, and yet Europe is beset by many challenges in migration, with the pandemic, with the economy. And, as a member of the European Parliament, could you reflect on what this Europe Day means for you and for your work?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And good evening from Dublin. And I know it's midday in California. Thanks for inviting me to join you to be part of this conversation. And let me say to you, 49 years ago today, Ireland voted in a referendum of the people to join the EU. It used to be called lots of different things, the coal and steel community at one stage. How dated does that sound now? But a wonderful project. And if you asked an Irish person today, you get about 84% who would be totally in favor of the EU project, of the EU. And when I think about the European Union, somebody asked me the other day, what words come to mind? And what comes to mind for me is leadership. Actually, I am very inspired, and inspiration. I've always been inspired by the EU, actually, going back over 30 years when I really started working on equality issues, particularly because Europe was leading the way. And I do see Europe as a leader, the greatest, as Robert, our Consul General, said, and thank you, Robert, lovely to see you here. And thank you for all the work the Irish team do in California. But, it's really, it's the biggest peace project. It's a fantastic peace project. And I had worked as a minister at council meetings, part of the ministers' meeting in Brussels. But now I'm a member of the parliament. So we have the council where the ministers meet, prime ministers and ministers. And then we have the commission, which is the kind of the engine, putting all of the material together and leading as well. And then you have the parliament. And when I became a member 2 years ago, I decided after being in national politics to run for Europe. When I go into the parliament and I see 27 member states, working together, you hear that great mix of languages. You see the different cultures, the different points of view, the different languages. And you see this huge machine working together on the issues of the day. I'm still inspired. You can't but be inspired by this coming together. And in the current parliament, I would say more than ever, there is a consensus has to be built because, there aren't clear big majorities. We really have to work across party, and you really have to try and find the center ground. Now, you do get the extremes as well, obviously, whether left or right, depending on how you'd view it. But it is an amazing project. And when you ask me about Europe Day, that's my immediate reaction, that it's worth fighting for, it's worth maintaining, and it's worth being committed to. And that's why so many of us are so sad about what's happened with Brexit and the UK leaving.
Thank you so much, Frances. You've given us quite a bit to think about. So it's an inspiration for you and your role. That much is clear. And yet I want to sort of hone in on something that you mentioned, and that is the challenge of Brexit. In your view, what is going to be the sort of lasting impact of Brexit on the future cohesiveness of the European Union? Is there a chance, for example, of a Brexit or some other member state leaving, or has it somehow forged even greater unity among the remaining member states? What's your view on this, the impact of Brexit?
Well, I was in the Parliament on the last day when the various members for Scotland, Wales, and and England left. There was terrible sadness amongst many of them, and of course there was a group who had fought from the beginning to get out of Europe, who'd been represented there, Farage and his colleagues. But the sadness on so many of the people who were leaving was just really striking. I mean, there were tears, terrible upset that they were leaving. But I think what's true is that actually people have united. I don't get any sense, the question you're asking, is there any sense of contagion? Not at all, actually. And one of the things, we were very struck by in Ireland, and I have been really struck by since I went there, is the incredible support Ireland has got. The unity around a small member state and the particular difficulties we could face with Brexit, the border potentially being reimposed, the difficulty with access to goods and services and movement on the island and so on, were all dealt with in the protocol. It's not the end of the story. We've more work to do. But I don't believe that, there's any question of any contagion of people wanting to leave. But what you do have, and being very honest with you, what you see in the Parliament at the moment, you do see challenges in relation to the rule of law, for example, in Poland and Hungary. You do see concerns about judicial independence in some countries, and you do have very serious debates around those points, particularly with a number of member states. If I look at an area that I have a particular interest in, gender equality and the famous Istanbul Convention, which is really a convention to encourage member states to work on that huge issue of violence against women, you have 5 or 6 member states who still haven't ratified it because actually they see it as a Trojan horse for LGBTQI rights. Which is extraordinary when you think of it. So, it's not without its tensions. It's 27 very different cultures. I've been struck by, for example, how the phrase gender equality is suddenly under attack from quite a number of member states, so much so that the council don't use it now when they're putting out a message after their meetings. So, I've been surprised at some of the tensions I see, but equally, I see great work in, challenging, dealing with climate change, leadership in relation to that. Very keen to lead on digital issues as well. And I think everything now is seen through that lens of COVID, of the digital future, of equality, of the care issues, the care economy, very important at the moment, and climate change, as I've said. So, we are leading, I think, probably around the world. You're doing an amazing job in California yourself on many of these issues, but I think Europe is in there amongst the leaders of the world in relation to some of those issues.
I want to pick up, Frances, on the point that you made about an issue which you've had a long career in contributing sort of policy developments, and that has to do with gender equality. So as I'm sure many in the audience know, there was really this unfortunate scandal with Ursula von der Leyen at this meeting in Turkey, in which no chair was offered for her, Chairgate, I believe it's been called on Twitter. There are these challenges with some of the member states, Hungary and Poland come to mind, when it comes to issues of gender equality with some of the current governments. And yet we also have the example of Ireland, in which you had really a lot of polarization around issues of women's rights and issues of gender equality. So I wonder if you could say something about how the work that you have done as former Minister of Justice and Equality in Ireland with the women's rights nonprofits that you worked with, and then of course in your current role as member of European Parliament, your committee work dealing with gender issues. Are there specific ways that you have kind of used your experience in Ireland to inform parliamentary discussions and to inform issues of polarization around gender and women's rights in other member states? Could you say something about that for our audience?
Gosh, you'd have to stop me talking about that. I could go on forever. Let's start with Sofagate. I mean, this is what it's been called. And, you know, it's quite interesting because you had people of equal status going into a room, and you had two chairs up at the front, and the president of the commission, Ursula von der Leyen, you know, kind of looked and stood and sort of, where's my chair? Now, there hadn't been advanced protocol because of COVID and so on, but there had obviously been some, but not enough to deal with the issue. But I think what happened, she came into the parliament just over a week ago, and she gave this amazing speech where she said, I felt hurt and I felt alone. And, you know, it resonated with women everywhere, because who amongst us hasn't had some sort of an experience where you made a suggestion and some man, you know, made the same suggestion and he was referenced and you weren't. I've certainly had that happen to me again and again at the highest levels. You see this, but that's, you know, so she actually came in and called it out and named it. And people said, you know, that's a hard thing to do, to admit. She said, I felt alone and I felt hurt. But she was also, of course, calling out the inequality in the situation. And it sparked a huge debate and huge interest in, across Europe. And generally speaking, both women and men reacted and said, you know, she was right to call it out and name it. And then you add that to what's happening to women in Turkey anyway, where they were going into a room to discuss equality and the Istanbul Convention, you know, named after the city of Istanbul, the irony that Turkey had just withdrawn from it. So that was that issue, was really about, you know, the general treatment of women. And we all know, everyone on this call knows, it has changed dramatically. If I look at Ireland, and you've asked me about the history of Ireland, we've made incredible strides. But there is unfinished business. And I would often say there's an unfinished democracy. There are unfinished democracies. And when you don't have a critical mass of people of women in government, in decision making, on boards, and I know in California you've taken some action on that recently, then, you know, it is unfinished. And it's unfinished in other ways as well, in relation, you know, to lots of other issues as well, the LGBTQI plus community, in relation to race and so on. And we have disability. There are so many. If we really want an inclusive society, we've a lot of work to do. But you're dealing with, you know, cultural issues and attitudes. And I suppose it's taken quite a while in Ireland, but we've had a dramatic change in relation to our social legislation. As Minister for Justice, I did the referendum on marriage equality, and had the privilege of signing the legislation and, you know, bringing it into an act in Ireland. And but that was about building bridges. You know, it was about people telling individual stories. It was about a partnership between the government and NGOs. It was a team effort. It was a very, very big team effort between the government and individuals who told their stories. That was really the most powerful element of that in the Irish debate. But in terms of gender across Europe, I mean, what we do have is still, you know, we do still have work to do. And what you learn is that it's not something that's finished, it's something that's ongoing, and we have to be consistently working on it. And, if you look at the various criteria by which you judge it, if I start, just to mention maybe a number of them, you look at equal pay. We're now bringing in an equal pay directive, which will apply across all the member states, where companies will have to show what they're paying, and respecting competition and so on. But the belief being that transparency in companies over 250 employees, we're bringing in new legislation for transparency of pay, where you can't be asked about your previous salary, and where there has to be information published, because what you find is people are getting different pay, men and women for the same job. In Europe, we have a 39% pension gap. I mentioned at the beginning, before we came on air, that, in terms of digital and AI, we're very concerned about the digital gap across Europe. And how are we going to get the STEM subjects? We're finding that actually there's a decline across Europe in young women doing the STEM subjects. That's extraordinary at a time when there's so much educational progress for women and for men. But there is that digital gap. And then I've mentioned violence against women. During COVID, this is quite extraordinary. You wonder what century we're living in. We've had a 30% increase in violence against women right across Europe. And then you have certain member states, who are behind in working on equality. And you still have, cultural factors holding women back. And I guess the big thing I've started talking about more, and I think we're all sharing who care about this issue of equality, is the economic loss to Europe if we don't give and create the kind of equal opportunities that we all want to see. I mean, you're talking about losing huge amounts of money between now and 2050 to our European economies. So, I mean, Christine Lagarde has done great work on this when she was in the IMF, publishing the stats about the GDP loss right around the world because women are not being involved in our economies as much as they need to be. So I think there's lots of lessons about what you do about each one of those issues. I mean, there's very clear implementation plans, but we could boost EU GDP by between 1.95 trillion to 3.15 trillion by 2050 if we really worked on this issue. And I think there's equally amazing stats around the world in relation to it. Now, I think the best companies are clearly aware of this. They clearly see that diversity makes a difference. They're bringing diversity into their boards, and they're leading the way, a bit like those companies that are leading the way on climate change. They see this as the future, and they're moving into the innovation that's needed for climate change and the innovation that's needed to make the transition to a carbon neutral economies. But on the gender issue, I mean, what I'm finding, even within the Parliament, is that we have to be very alert all of the time. We have to push to make sure that the gender issues are taken account of. That's in terms of representation. The Conference on the Future of Europe, for example, we discovered recently, because it was the leaders of the parties were going to form a fairly big part of the executive, there was a danger it was going to be way out of proportion of male to female. And that's like the most up-to-date conference we're doing in Europe on the future. So we had to try and ensure that representatives coming from other arenas then balance that out. So, you have to be very alert to these issues, because the danger is that young girls, will not get the kind of opportunity that we almost take for granted now. But when you begin to examine the different issues, you see that there is still work to be done. And that's true, I think, around the world. And Europe is leading on gender equality, but there are still those issues I've outlined to you. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
Thank you so much, Frances. Again, you just give me so many different points that I want to jump onto, but I will select one. So I think it's very interesting that you made the point that advances for women in the workplace, these are going to result in large increases for GDP. And this issue of how women's equality is linked with economic growth, it's something I would like you to expand a bit more, particularly in connection with your work in the Parliament on the EU recovery plan. Because as we know, just the world economy, and of course Europe's economy, has been devastated by the coronavirus pandemic. And as you alluded to a bit there, we've seen just millions of women leaving the workforce because of the caring duties that they had to take care of, and also because of the challenges with medical treatment and response to the pandemic itself. So could you say a bit more about the scope, your role in the development of the EU Economic Recovery Plan, and whether it will be enough to attack the economic challenges in this multidimensional way you alluded to, taking issues of gender equality really at its core, as opposed to in a sort of add-on or peripheral way?
Yes. This is what you have to watch all the time, that it's just an add-on. I did a report for the Parliament that was passed by the plenary a few months ago, and it was on the differential impact of COVID on women and men. And there has been a differential impact. Now, we will have to continue to monitor the statistics, but very sadly, you know, more men are dying. And then, but the whole socio, and we don't know, you know, the vulnerability in men that is, you know, the exact interaction with COVID. We need to do more research and study to understand that. But the socioeconomic impacts, then there is a differential impact. And I think if we want to have a recovery that works, we have to be very aware of the differential impacts going forward, and make sure that the huge recovery funds, both in the States and in Europe, are used in a way that is, you know, that we have gender budgeting, if you like, that there's a gender impact assessment, that it reaches the needs of women. We also, for example, when we had the crisis in Europe before, the Eurogroup president at the time said, he put the two responses into stark contrast. He said, during the sovereign debt crisis, it took us 3 years to agree to a similar sized backstop for sovereigns. This time we did it in 2 weeks. The financial package from Europe has been extraordinary. It has been timely, it's been fast, it's enabled member states to manage the pandemic in a way that was you know, far better than the economic crisis in 2008 to 13 or 14, which I was the minister cutting back budgets, I have to say then, and it was horrendous. And, you know, it's often called the austerity phase. This time we gave the money, enormous money raised, own resources raised by own resources, by European bonds for the first time, and incredible money given to all of our member states, and a huge package. It's called the Resilience and Recovery Fund, 750 billion. In February this year, we voted as MEPs for that, the EU's Recovery and Resilience Facility. This will be spread out among the member states. It's a combination of loans and grants. And it's really, I mean, 30% must be spent on climate change and a green economy. And also there must be expenditure on investment and reforms. So it's not building back the same, it's about building back better. It's a very well-known phrase in relation to COVID. It's about, you know, looking to the future. And I think what we will have to see is that money used to look at what we've learned from COVID as well. I mean, we've learned a lot of new things as well. You know, we have learned how to be resilient in many ways. We have learned about remote working. We've learned more about combining work and family life and some of the challenges around that for both men and women. We've learned about the care economy and how fragile that is and how dependent we are on it. And you look at the statistics across Europe, for example, I imagine it's probably the same in the States, but you know, 76% of healthcare workers are women, 93% of childcare workers are women, 95% of domestic cleaners are women, 86% of personal care workers are women, 82% of cashiers. And you have all of these caring jobs, which we undervalue right across Europe, around the world, actually. And yet the potential to build a care economy, if we do it in the right way, to do extra training, you know, to have a career progression, we can build our economies by building the care economy. And I think that is a lesson. We stood on the streets and clapped the nurses right across and clapped the caregivers, but it's not enough to clap them. We now have to build the kind of care systems in, and care for the elderly, of course, has been a huge part of this. And we've had so many deaths in residential facilities. So I think that's a lesson that, you know, we have to learn. But the economic forecasts for Europe at the moment, and indeed for Ireland, you know, they're pretty good for Ireland. It's 4.5% growth and, you know, moving upwards the year after. And in the European economy, well, it's 3.7% in 21 and 3.9 in 22. I mean, it's there are signs of hope, but it's going to take a lot of work. We don't quite know yet what the extent of business collapses are going to be. I mean, some businesses will not survive, but I think when it comes to entrepreneurs and small businesses, we are putting the money in at a European level. We're putting the supports in. Every member state now has to do what they call a national recovery plan by the end of this month. And the Parliament will not, or not the Parliament, but the Commission and indeed the Parliament will not pass those recovery plans unless they take account of equality in the broadest sense, unless they are, you know, shifting the way they do business, focusing on climate, innovation and research. So I think you've certainly seen, you know, great financial supports. It's been a bit slower on the vaccine, but we are exporting around the world as well to 190 countries. And we want to make sure that everybody can afford vaccination as well.
Thank you so much, Frances. To shift gears a bit, I would like to turn to the topic of the role and place of the EU in the world, particularly vis-a-vis the US and China. And, you know, looking back at former President Trump's legacy, it's clear that things became, relations between the US and the EU really deteriorated. You had President Trump, former President Trump, making several statements about even the viability and usefulness of the transatlantic relationship at all, throwing it into question. However, at the same time, in some ways, former US President Trump was not the first to, for example, shift US interests abroad away from Europe, and for example, in the famed pivot to Asia, or to voice concerns that Europe was not footing its share of the defense bill for joint defense. Would you say something about the EU's sort of current place in the world, given that we have a new Biden-Harris administration that certainly seems to bring Europe into its embrace once more as a partner and as a friend? Please say something for our audience about how you see the transatlantic relationship.
Yes, well, I think with President Biden now in the White House, I think there's a great opportunity to revitalize the transatlantic relationship. I see huge energy and actual delight, because you did have a president who really didn't like the EU. It had really nothing positive to say about it before. That was very disappointing. So it is a fresh start. We don't necessarily expect, you know, that things will be the same. I think there's a changing geopolitical situation in the world, China, the US, and Europe. But I think certainly from an Irish point of view, we've never had such a prime opportunity, I think, to act as a bridge builder between the EU and the US. And we'll certainly want to do that from an Irish perspective. I had the honor of accompanying President Biden when he was on his Irish visit. And I well remember going to a small town and up towards the north And, you know, when he came out, going around, meeting everybody, an absolute great sense of engagement. And I think he does personify that. And the EU will certainly be very open to that. No question of it. There is a real, you know, wish to, as I say, to revitalize the relationship. I think, you know, his decision on to join the Paris Accord has gone down extremely well, very positive in relation to the attitude he's taking on climate. But equally, you know, we're aware that the US wants to build its own economy, is building its own economy, is looking at, you know, American firms and businesses around the world, and, you know, is examining how they will develop in the future. We're very proud of the many American businesses, for example, that are in Ireland and continue to come into Ireland. I think because we are an English-speaking country, the only English-speaking country, you know, left in the EU now, with the UK gone, we are the bridge to the EU with a very educated workforce and so on. And, you know, companies are able to retain talent here in Ireland, and that's incredibly important now, as we know, right across the world. But in terms of the America, and you asked about defense, yes, I mean, I think that is very much going to be a debate in the conference on the future of Europe. And it's some countries, you know, we have a number of neutral countries in the membership of the EU, Ireland being one of them. But you also have countries who want to put more money into defense. But I think what you will see is more cooperation on foreign interference in democratic processes. We have a new committee looking at that at the moment. I'm on that committee, and there's some very disturbing information coming to us on that committee about foreign interferences. We're really very, very concerned about it. Just today, I was at a meeting where we had a presentation on some interferences from Russia, actually. I mean, it's quite concerning, the kind of data that we're seeing. So I think what you're going to see is more and more cooperation, you know, on cybercrime, on sharing intelligence data, on working together against terrorism. And a European army, people are quite ambivalent about that. But what you are seeing is a rapid defense force in terms of engaging on peace enforcement. You're going to see more of that, I believe. Ireland will be involved in that. I come from an army family myself, actually. And, you know, Ireland has always served on peacekeeping. In terms of China, I mean, we've had this compete, you know, cooperate and confront. But I have to say the situation has deteriorated very considerably in relation to China and the EU in the last number of weeks, really considerably. I mean, China, very sadly, I have to say, appears to be closing down on the dialogue on human rights with the EU and elsewhere. The EU is very concerned about human rights in China, and in any discussions about trade, that's going to, you know, that's going to be center stage. And in fact, the investment agreement has been put on hold because of just last week, because of the deterioration in the relationship with China. And we've had several of my own colleagues, you know, sanctions have been put against them, and in what I think is an overreaction. But it's kind of tit for tat now, and very concerning. I mean, China is the EU's second biggest trading partner, and economic and, if you like, trade relations must be at the core of the EU-China cooperation. But it's actually going through, I would say, a deteriorating situation at present. And I don't think that's good for the world. I mean, I personally would like to see, you know, a better relationship. I would like to see those tensions, you know, not being as pronounced as they are at the moment. There's always going to be tensions, but it's very worrying to see the sort of breakdown that we're seeing at the moment. And I think the EU and the US will want to work together on that as well. I mean, I think it's in the world's interest. And Europe, I think, is focusing more on its own identity, on being stronger, on economic issues, developing its innovation, but also on the political stage. Certainly Europe wants to be a player, and perhaps a stronger player on world affairs than it has been in the past. And the conference on the future of Europe, it's one of the issues we're asking our citizens. what do you want the role of Europe to be on the world stage in the geopolitical sense going forward?
Okay, I now see, thank you, Francis. I now see that we should shift to questions from the audience, as several of you have posted in the chat. So, Francis, we have a question in which someone would like you to expand further your perspective on Brexit, particularly as it concerns the Irish border and recent violence and unrest. What do you think success can look like? And relatedly, do you think the episodes of unrest will grow?
I think we're at a very challenging moment in relation to the North and Brexit. I think the protocol gives a great opportunity to the North in the sense that they have, if you like, the best of both worlds. They have the opportunity to be part of the single market and also to trade with the UK. But I think the whole question, you know, of identity and of confidence to do that is not there at the moment. I think people, particularly the unionist community, feel very threatened by what's happened. I think promises were made to them by the UK, by the British Prime Minister, that, you know, things would be the same, and they are obviously a little different. There is a border down, there is a, you know, the concept of a border in the Irish Sea. You've elections coming up there. You've a change of leader in unionism, and you've just had elections, local elections, mayoral elections, and elections in Scotland as well. So you begin to see across the UK, you know, the Scottish Nationalist Party wanting a referendum. You see the Labour Party very strong in Wales. You see, I think, you saw increase, you know, violence in the north. You saw a bomb being placed under a car where a 3-year-old normally sits. I mean, potentially, you know, absolutely, totally serious and dangerous, life-threatening. So I think it just calls for greater leadership all around. We've always had to talk when it comes to the north, with the help very often of USA. And I think we just have to really see, you know, we've got to pull out the very best of leadership. I'm glad to say that we're seeing better engagement between the EU and the UK now. A lot of work being done on the implementation of the protocol. And we really do need to just get on with implementing the protocol so people can see real change. But, you know, I'm not sure that the commitment is absolutely there on both sides. I think it's on the EU side, but it's been harder to engage on the UK side for a variety of reasons. But I think it's happening now, and I hope it will continue. And, you know, we have the Good Friday Agreement, and we need to implement that fully. There's aspects of that that still haven't been implemented. So look, it's the old story. When you're in a peace process, it's ongoing. It doesn't end. We have to continue. But we have had a fantastic peace process with huge commitment and huge leadership. And John Hume always talked about the role that the EU played in the Irish peace process. And, you know, our Taoiseach and our Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, Leo Varadkar, Simon Coveney, you know, there's huge engagement to ensure that we can make progress again. So look, there isn't an alternative. You know, we've got to get back. But Brexit has been, you know, everybody loses with Brexit, really. Nobody wins, actually. It's just, it's a losing situation, actually, I believe, for everyone, including the UK. But of course, they would argue differently. And it is a democratic decision at the end of the day. But the protocol is the solution, you know, this complicated protocol. That was a solution. It was the best we could come up with to move forward and ensure we didn't have a border. Everybody worked for years. And we just signed the final, you know, the trade and cooperation agreement just about 2-3 weeks ago in the European Parliament. So it's about making it work now. So we've just got to get on with it, and let's hope there's no, you know, further deterioration. You know, so that's kind of where we're at the moment in relation to it. I'm sure Robert would give you an even more up-to-date comment on Northern Ireland at the moment, because all our diplomats worked so hard on it, and in the same way that they worked across Europe, across America, we got fabulous support, I have to say, from American politicians.
Can you say something about that, Robert? Do you feel comfortable, particularly the American role, since we have you with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's just 2 points I'd make. I know that a joint visit by Vice President Sefcovic of the European Commission and Lord Frost, who is the UK envoy, will take place to the north. And that kind of engagement with communities is going to be really, really important, because I think, as Francis said, there is a lot of vulnerability, a lot of nervousness, particularly within the unionist community. And that kind of engagement to really understand their concerns, it'll be important. But I think the important point which we made on that trip is that, from both sides, is that the protocol is the only way forward, and maximizing the value of the protocol is going to be and implementing it in full. It will be the best way of dealing with some of the issues that have arisen. And I think on the point of the US, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the leadership shown by Speaker Pelosi, of course, our own here in San Francisco, Richie Neal, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and current President Biden, on the importance that Brexit would not harm and undermine the Good Friday Agreement, had an enormous impact on the direction of those negotiations and their continued engagement. I know there's I'm sure you know there's a bipartisan bill going through the US Senate at the moment, which is going to speak to that position as well. Has support. Susan Collins, Senator Martinez have got it, are leading it. So you'll see that commitment by the US to peace on our island is unwavering, it's unequivocal, and it is bipartisan. And I think we are very thankful for that. And I think that really does mean that there will be no return, as I said, to the borders of the past on our island.
So,
I mean, I think
yes,
this,
yes.
just to say again to you, I think this opportunity for Northern Ireland to make the very best of the economic situation it now finds itself in, with access to the UK and the EU. I mean, I think once the business community starts really engaging around that, there is a lot of potential, because, economic success will be a great help as well.
Okay, thank you so much for this engaged response to our audience members' question. Now, I know one of the key issues for the UK when it was a member of the EU was better regulation, less red tape. And indeed, numerous reforms were undertaken within EU processes and decision-making procedures to accommodate this interest of the UK when it was a member. Yet there still is a public perception, certainly among Americans abroad, of the EU as being particularly bureaucratic and really an excessive regulator. What is your response, Francis, to this sort of criticism? And can you perhaps also give our audience some examples of ways in which this better regulation has been implemented in the EU?
Yes, I mean, I sometimes I think it's a rather stereotyped view of the EU, that it overregulates. I mean, if you want to have good standards, I think you do have to regulate. What I will say about the EU is that it's complex. I mean, any one day, the range of initiatives, of own initiative reports, of legislation, of new recommendations, of new directives, it's quite extraordinary. I think it has got less bureaucratic, but it is very concerned with standards. There's no doubt about that. I mean, just this week, last week, I was part of a trialogue, where everybody comes together to discuss the final part of legislation. And it was on what we call just transition legislation, to make sure for those regions that are heavily dependent on coal and gas and so on, when they're making a transition, the climate transition, that they won't be left behind. And it's a terrific program. But the level of detail we went into about, we were really trying to get a balance between making it easy for business to access that money and not have it sort of bogged down in any sort of red tape. But at the same time, we were wanting to apply taxonomy rules to it, you know, the green criteria by which, you know, businesses would be eligible. We wanted to apply, you know, gender awareness, equality awareness as well. And, you know, some people might say, well, you know, you're doing too much in terms of regulation. That's just one recent example I can give you. And yet, if you want to make sure that member states abide properly by the criteria that are set, I think you have to have that. And it's the same in the Recovery and Resilience Fund. I mean, there's very clear criteria laid down for the member states about the recovery funds. And, you know, I think it's right, because the range of criteria means that we're taking Europe forward, and we can't let member states, if you like, just indulge same as. It has to be different. It has to take account of the post-COVID challenges and recovery period. So I guess I would defend the EU. I mean, we certainly, it's a very open system, you know. We're working now on the Digital Services Act and a Digital Markets Act. And I have had very many, you know, international American companies, but who are international, approach us to discuss, you know, how that's going to impact on them. The Commission meets people all the time to discuss the legislation, how it can change, what their concerns are, how it will impact on them. So I actually find it a very open system, but it does take time. And you have to be very patient, but it does get there in the end. So look, I guess all governments have to handle bureaucracy better. That's the reality. So there is scope for improvement. But, you know, just in those examples, I hope I give you a sense of why I think that they need to do it, because you're dealing with 27 different, you know, member states.
Absolutely. I think that's certainly a fair point. The fact that we're dealing with 27 national governments that have agreed to come together within the EU structures is certainly relevant for questions of bureaucracy and regulation. Now we have time for one more audience question, and then we'll have to wrap up. And my colleague Julia will also be posting an audience survey in the chat, because we'd love your feedback on this event, so that we can plan more like it, and maybe even have you come back and join us again, Francis. I know you're very busy.
Hopefully in person the next time.
Yes, that would be fantastic. But so to turn to the final audience question, as you know, with warming temperatures attributed to human-caused climate change, one of the things we've seen has been the disappearance of ice in the Arctic. This has made more sea lanes that are available for military and trading vessels, but also that other northern nations are ramping up their military presence. And it's also motivated kind of the US to put more focus on defense and competition for trade, particularly concerning this region. Could you say something about what the EU's kind of position and perspective is on the opening up of the Arctic, and you know, ways in which the EU can articulate its own geopolitical position vis-a-vis the US, but then also even in China and Russia as well?
Well, as the EU's first Arctic policy was outlined in 2008, and just in July this year, July 20 actually, the EU opened a consultation on the way forward for the EU Arctic policy. And a huge part of this, I think, will be the EU Green Deal, which I mentioned earlier, which I think is really very progressive. Obviously, the Arctic is facing enormous climate challenges, and the region is hugely transforming. And I think it has to be addressed by the EU in this Arctic policy we're now looking at again, because it concerns us all from a climate perspective. And we have to be to the forefront and working with America in terms of a global approach to tackling these issues in the Arctic, no question about that. And, you know, the current approach centers around climate change and safeguarding the Arctic environment, sustainable development and international cooperation. And I suppose it's one of the examples of how, you know, it is about all of us safeguarding our world together. We can't do it on our own. And the importance of, you know, sharing climate change policies around the world and being serious about the implementation of them. And it's not going to be easy, and at an individual level or corporate or social level. But I think already across Europe, we see more money being available for innovation, more you know, we're looking at sustainable finance, but we're seeing huge amounts of money interested in developing the technology that we're going to need and interested in inputting into this area, more money than there are projects. And of course, I haven't mentioned it, but one of the issues across Europe is really to try and keep some of our innovation. I know California would like us to export all of our innovation to you, but and we do send you some of our best people, but we really do want to try and keep innovation in Europe and develop the European economies as well for the kind of technologies that we will need going forward. But I certainly think the question is very relevant, and it's at the core of the you know, our Green Deal. And I think Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, has really led very well on it. And you know, there was hesitancy, you know, about going as far as the Green Deal does, but it's really got support. You know, it's got support. Did you ask me a further question about the geopolitical situation? Was there something else you wanted me to address there?
Well, I think it would also be good to know a bit about the issue of natural gas and oil deposits that have been found or ascertained and estimated to be in the Arctic region that now might be cost effective to reach with the melting of the seas. So, you know, in your view, does this tension with new fossil fuel reserves being suddenly more accessible, does this pose perhaps a unique challenge to the climate change policies in the Green New Deal as set forth by the EU? Or is it something that you think current climate change policy developed in the EU can address? Because it's a real tension, this view that even more fossil fuels could potentially be released and that countries would have interest in accessing them in the Arctic.
Well, you know, you're either serious about, you know, about climate change or you're not. And I think really it is a tension. Of course, it's a tension. And I mean, you've had an issue in the States, haven't you, just in the last few days in relation to security and so on. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, we're very keen to use the funding opportunities that we have to help areas transition. Now, how that would apply, you know, to the Arctic and how you begin to deal with that issue, I don't think I don't have a simple answer to it. But I do know that, you know, every place is going to suffer if we don't reduce our use of fossil fuels, and that it's an absolute imperative at present. But of course, you know, this transition period is going to be very difficult, and you see it in areas, you know, like Poland and Hungary particularly as well, with their huge dependence on fossil fuels, and that's why we put, you know, so much funding into helping develop other industries there, or other skills and retraining and so on. So I don't have a great answer for you in that, but you know, I think that you're right, the tension is there, the challenge is there, and there's, you know, if we want to save the world and protect the world, and we have to move from fossil fuels. That's the reality.
Well, Frances, it's clear that we could continue to discuss these and many other issues for at least another half an hour, but our time is up. And so I want to thank you heartily for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure. I've learned a great deal from you, and I want to thank you and hope that we can see each other in person one day. My thanks as well go to Consul General Robert O'Driscoll. Thank you so much for connecting our institute with the Member of Parliament, Ms. Fitzgerald. Thank you also to Professor Flynn. Thank you so much for your support as director of our Irish Studies program at the Institute. And many thanks as well go to my colleague Julia for her fantastic management of this event and the rest of my colleagues at IES. Thank you as well to the audience for your engaged participation. And please do fill out the survey. The link has been posted in the chat, and we'll also send one to you by email in case you don't have the chance to fill that out. Thank you once again, and be well.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.